Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is peaks and pitfalls of conserving charismatic species, and it will be presented by our fabulous NatHab Expedition Leader, Charlie Reinertsen. Charlie, thank you so much for being here today and presenting yet another fascinating topic. Let's go ahead and dive in.
Thank you, Sunny, and thank you for everyone for being here this afternoon. I hope you're having a great Friday here in Adirondack Park. We have a very rare heavy rain event in mid-January, so we're hoping that there's still winter to come, but definitely seeing some strange weather patterns. But today, I just wanted to dive into the topics that we'll cover. So talk a little bit about me. We'll talk about what this idea of charismatic conservation is, and we'll take a look at some case studies of conservation efforts and the impact that they've had, and discuss some alternatives of how we can look at conservation and approach conservation, because there are so many different ways to approach it and a lot of different outcomes that can result from different strategies. And if we have time, we'll take a quick peek at a couple of the trip itineraries around some of the species that we'll be talking about today. That'll bring us into two areas where I've guided for natural habitat adventures. That's with the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem in Grand Teton and Yellowstone, and then in the Kingdom of the Monarchs in Michoacan, Mexico. So a little bit about me. I'm the founder of the Northern Peatlands Project, and I run a multimedia company called Two Line Studio. And my mission is really to help organizations and companies share their conservation and natural resource message. And I also pursue some of my own interests, like the Northern Peatlands Project, through that work. And I've had some incredible opportunities to travel throughout the world, many of them with natural habitat adventures. And I've spent the last 10 years in science communications. Most recently, I worked on a climate solutions exhibit that brought me up to Adirondack Park. And another piece of my story is that I've spent a lot of time with turtles. And this is really what launched my science career. I was doing research on the softshell turtle, which is this species here. And it kind of ties into our talk because species like this don't get a lot of airtime. And a lot of people, when they look at something like this, see something that's maybe strange, maybe ugly. When I look at it, it's a beautiful specimen of Apelone mutica, the smooth softshell turtle, that ultimately we were able to make recommendations to the Department of Natural Resources to help conserve this species because of some of the habitat loss that it's been facing, as well as the challenges of a changing climate. So just to start to dive into this idea of charismatic conservation and where dollars are going and what species they are or are not supporting, I thought it'd be fun to do a quick A or B test. So I'm going to share two different species at a time, and just in your own mind, think about which one you think the majority of people would see and immediately respond with thinking about ways to support that organism. So here we have a moose. This picture was taken in Wyoming, but you could easily find this moose throughout different areas in North America, compared to the A/B test of a snapping turtle. And next we have an American bison, which its range has greatly been reduced. It used to have a range all the way through North America. Now it's just in pocketed populations, and there have been huge conservation efforts to reintroduce this species and to think about how to restore prairie ecosystems with bringing back big herbivores like bison. And then we've got another species that shares this habitat, the boreal toad. Next, we've got elk, and here's a beautiful picture I took in summer of an elk mother and her calf nursing or having recently nursed, compared to a garter snake that also shares similar habitat. A merlin, which is an iconic, beautiful bird of prey that we often see talked about and referenced, compared to a fly. I wouldn't be able to tell you what particular species of fly this is, but that also kind of lends itself as well to this idea. Now, I'm kind of being tongue in cheek. I think a lot of you on this call are probably thinking to yourselves, hey, if you tell me a story about that fly, about why that fly is in trouble, I'm ready to help. And so this is not a blanket term, but it's kind of looking back at the history of conservation and thinking about where have our dollars gone when we think about investing in conservation. And so there's this idea of umbrella species. And this is kind of the concept that we're going to dive into today. The theory behind umbrella species is that if you focus your conservation efforts on one species, you are in effect protecting all of the other species that share the habitat of that particular species. So let's put it into a little bit more of a story. So we're going to transport ourselves to the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. This particular wolf is 926F. That's not particularly important, but it's just fun to know the individuals that we're looking at. And this wolf was seen in Yellowstone National Park. So I took this picture in about 2014, 2013. And in Yellowstone National Park, we have a pretty interesting situation where wolves were locally extinct. They were extirpated roughly in the early 1900s. So essentially there's some debate, but around 1925, the last wolf was spotted. And at that point in time, the federal government, the state government had put out calls to action and had hired bounty hunters to remove this predator from the landscape. At the time, wolves were thought to be dangerous species and that they were negatively impacting what a lot of people cared about at the time, which is these large herbivores from including elk as well as bison. And so the National Park Service was initially set up as a way to promote the enjoyment of our natural resources. And at that initial time, of which Yellowstone National Park was the first national park, you had this moment when the national government was only protecting some species that were viewed as game species, like the elk and the bison and deer. And this had huge consequences for the larger ecosystem. So here's a shot. This is just happens to be, so when you're in the national park, you can't take any souvenirs. So if an animal dies, that animal rests there unless it is moved or devoured by other species. So this is actually on a hike going up to Rose Creek Pen, which is one of the pens where they reintroduced wolves. And there's a little creek running behind it. And I grabbed this image because noticeably, there's very little vegetation on the banks of this little creek. And so the story is that when you took away this apex predator, this wolf, there was this cascading effect on the ecosystem at large that led to some pretty severe consequences. So the thought was, oh, we remove this predator and all of a sudden the prey species, the elk, the bison, are going to have really healthy populations. But what we ended up finding out is a few things. One, elk, and when they're allowed to browse wherever they like, they just feed on their favorite thing in the whole world, and that is willow. So moose and elk were all just spending their times near the river just mowing down willow. But willow is this really important species that helps to ensure that the banks of the river are staying intact. And so if you mow down all the willow, you start to have erosion. And then you get muddy banks, the river health is in peril. And the other thing that happened is that elk and bison started congregating more and more and more. And now these are already herd animals, so they spend time together. But when huge numbers of these animals spend time together in a really concentrated area near all their favorite foods, that is the breeding ground for disease. So you started to see an uptick in sick animals because the wolves were not on the landscape to be able to remove them. Now, we've been looking at this picture for a while, and I'm curious if anyone has keen eyes, because there are actually two wolves feeding on a carcass in the very center of this picture. I didn't have a very long lens, but going back to that first picture, this is 926F. She is with her mate feeding in this picture, and you can make out a gray wolf and a black shape right in the center, and then there's a carcass in between them. And just as a side note, I was able to enjoy watching them feed, and then she was running up the hill to go feed her brand new pups that year. So just a little side note there of some of the wildlife encounters that you can have. But what that story tells you, if you're not familiar with this story already, is that we reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone. And this happened in 1995. And this is an example of two of the terms that we've talked about so far. Number one, charismatic conservation. You know, wolves, while divisive, there are a lot of people that are anti-wolf reintroduction, and then there are a lot of pro-wolf people, but regardless, they grab your attention. A lot of people are talking about wolves, are paying attention to wolves, and the number of people that are visiting Yellowstone National Park with the goal of seeing a wolf is astounding. So just the tourism dollars and those dollars that are going into helping to preserve this ecosystem as well. So if you've, just as a side note, if you've attended my talks in the past, usually they're a little more focused. This one is a little bit more scattered, and we're going to cover a lot of different things. And I promise if you stick it out until the end, I'll try and put a bow on it. But we might not get there. We'll see. So just to recap, in the early 1900s, we removed wolves. The thought was that that would help the prey population, the elk, the bison, the mule deer, the bighorn sheep. The National Park Service was set up to protect those game species for hunters to hunt and to enjoy them on the landscape. What this ended up doing was allowing those ungulates are hooved animals, allowed those ungulates to run rampant, and they ate all of their favorite foods, and it caused massive degradation along our rivers, where it just wiped out willow populations. Aspen stands that normally would regenerate were just mowed down, and their health was reduced. And so because of all of those impacts, a lot of scientists were able to come to the national government, the federal government, and say, look, we need to reintroduce wolves. We need to make this happen so that we can restore the ecosystem and bring balance back. And so that brought us to 1995, bringing the wolves back. And ever since then, Yellowstone has been a case study for what happens when you reintroduce a predator onto the landscape. Because if you look across North America, if you look across the world, we've removed those apex predators from a lot of ecosystems in a lot of places. We have a lot of local extirpations, which is a local extinction or removal of a species from a system. But we're about to geek out a little bit. And we're going to introduce this concept that I talk often about when I'm guiding. And I first learned about it when I was studying ecology in college. And I found that it was just this incredibly helpful system to, it's essentially a thought experiment to wrap our heads around what happens when we change the ecosystems around us. So stay with me. There's a ball. And this ball, as time progresses, is moving in one direction. So that's the timeline. It can't go backwards. Then this ball encounters cups as it moves along this track. Apologies for the terrible illustrations. It was the best I could do getting this ready in a efficient manner. But the idea is that this ball moves along this line and then it rests in one of those cups. And for the ball to move into another cup, there has to be a change. And you'll notice that as this ball moves along the line, every cup is a different size. So like I mentioned, a new change comes to that ecosystem and pushes this ball. But perhaps it's a small change and that ball just kind of moves back and forth and eventually settles down in the center of that cup. But what happens when it's a big change? That ball pops out and moves into another ecosystem state. And at first the ball is rocking back and forth and slowly it settles back into its initial position. So when wolves were extirpated, when they were removed from the ecosystem, that ball was pushed out of its initial cup and moved into another cup. And that cup represents a new status of ecosystem. And then at this point, wolves were reintroduced, and that's going to push that ball into a new cup. And this is where I find this model to be so helpful. Because when we reintroduce wolves, we don't simply go back in time. We can only move forward in the way that this model works. And so when we reintroduce wolves, that's a new pressure that pushes the ball out of this cup, moves it into another cup. And now we're going to study that ecosystem and try and understand what the changes are and what this new balance becomes, and then we can compare it to what we knew about what it used to be like when we had a fully intact ecosystem prior to removing wolves from this ecosystem. So that is the big question. What happens when you bring wolves back? And this is where you really start to understand that ecosystems are an incredibly complex thing. They're a system where every single organism is having impacts on the organisms around them. And this is where the umbrella species approach to conservation might not be enough. So let's go back and just talk about what happened to the wolves. So when we reintroduced wolves on the landscape, we started studying rivers. We started studying the ecology of rivers, what was happening along the banks of the river. And what we started to find is that plants started to grow back, willow started to grow back. And in part, that was because wolves were on the landscape moving those prey species around. The elk didn't congregate in the same numbers. They started to disperse across the landscape, and they moved into their more natural grazing pattern, which is to move across the landscape throughout time. So they're not staying in one single place, and that helps encourage new plant growth. It does all different kinds of things for the ecosystem. And so through studying the changes, we've been able to see new recruitment of aspen trees, all those saplings that were getting mowed down by greedy elk and moose in the winter. They're starting to grow back. We're seeing greater recruitment of willow stands along the river banks. And we also have been seeing changes in the population of elk and bison, but it hasn't been perfectly straightforward. It's been a little bit surprising because remember what we were talking about, where prey animals, when they congregate in one area, they can spread sickness. So wolves being on the landscape, they often are preying on the vulnerable, the weak. Sometimes that's the young, sometimes that's the old, but it's also the sick. And so it helps to prevent the spread of those contagions within that population. So we're continuing to study this because it's not been a perfect reversal back to what it used to be. And there are all kinds of factors that are playing into that. And the story is a little bit more than what we'll get into today. I want to be able to look at other case studies as well, but just let it, think about the fact that this ball and cup model just helps us understand that when we change an ecosystem, that is going to have impacts that prevent us from going back in time. And restoration efforts are doing as much as we can to simulate what it was like when we used to have a fully intact ecosystem. So let's go back to that initial A-B comparison and talk a little bit more about umbrella species. So let's look at these two species. And let's say our conservation efforts go to the umbrella species of moose. Now, moose share some of their habitat on the eastern seaboard with snapping turtles, and moose spend a lot of their time in riparian environments. So if we start to make sure that we conserve riparian ecosystems, river ecosystems, then we'll ensure that we have food availability for moose. But that's a very different conservation plan than what would be put in place if we were focusing our efforts on the snapping turtle. Now, this isn't a perfect example because snapping turtles are actually doing pretty well. They're a pretty resilient species. We're not in a lot of worry about this particular species. It's just more of kind of similar to the ball and cup. It's a little bit more of an exercise in thinking about what does it mean when we put our dollars towards a certain conservation effort. The next comparison, we've got bison, which occupy the plains in the Intermountain West right now. They used to have a much bigger range, and that overlaps with the boreal toad. But the toad is only in that ecosystem for a small period of time. The toad spends the rest of its life in forested areas and in ephemeral ponds that are only available so often. So if the conservation effort is really geared towards bison, it might not have in its plan to watch out for ephemeral ponds and to think about ways to make sure that those are available for toads as well as other species that might rely on them. So just to carry this idea through, comparing elk versus the western garter snake. They have a similar geographic range, as you can see by these two maps, but they have incredibly different food sources, very different habits and preferred ecosystems within that. And so this is just starting to show that if we continue to fundraise for conservation efforts with trying to entice people through these really charismatic species that we relate to, our dollars might not be best spent when we're faced with some really big challenges. So right now we're in the Anthropocene, right? So it's the era of human impact. We're facing the 7th greatest extinction, and we're facing climate change, these huge issues that are going to take a little bit more than just what charismatic conservation can deliver. We need a population of people, an entire planet of people who start to understand the nuances of our ecology and how we interface with natural systems and are a part of them. And then we need to feel and then act upon that knowledge of being within this ecosystem and relying on it to survive, and then supporting it. So there are a couple models out there right now. And there's this concept of natural climate solutions. So it's this idea that if we support our natural systems as a holistic thing, not just picking out one animal or another and hoping that conserving them will conserve the larger landscape, but it's a much more holistic approach. And this in particular is one of the items that the Nature Conservancy is pushing for. Now, this presentation, I'm grabbing some pieces from different groups. This is not a plug to support any certain organization. This is just a plug to let's get more informed about what conservation efforts are available and which ones might have the best opportunity to solve some of these huge issues that we're facing. But this idea of nature-based solutions is getting talked about a lot. And we're even seeing some governmental policies that are saying we need to pursue nature-based solutions. I'll give an example, and I'm sure you've heard about it. It's kelp forests. So we're exploring what would it mean if we started to farm kelp, encourage more growth of kelp, and kelp is an aquatic species on the ocean, right? So it's this forest underwater that has just incredible amounts of carbon. So the whole idea is that we could solve a couple issues. We could feed the planet with seaweed, and we could also start to store more carbon in those kelp forests. But that issue alone, if we just start to go out and put that in place, there are some issues with it because sometimes that requires extra fertilization of the ocean, and we need to understand the whole system that these actions are impacting. So places like the Nature Conservancy are putting out these essentially checklists to be able to say, okay, you have a nature-based solution. Now let's look through this guide to see if it checks all the boxes that we've put together to be able to decide if this is a successful and warranted action to be able to move forward in conservation. And I want to take a step back here for a second, because any conservation action that we take is good. And we should not spend any time really thinking about bad conservation efforts. But we need every solution that's available right now, and we need to put them into action as quickly as possible if we're going to address some of these huge issues that our ecosystems are facing. And so if we're going to move forward on all fronts, let's see if we can do it as strategically as possible so that we don't step into some of the same traps that we have in the past. So the principles of natural climate solutions that the Nature Conservancy is putting forward are that they're nature-based, sustainable, additional, measurable, and equitable. So working backwards, equitable meaning that if you put that solution in place, is it going to negatively impact certain populations of people around the world? Measurable, if you're putting all of this investment into this solution, do you have a way to be able to say that you actually have made a difference? Are you measuring the impact of what you're doing? Additional, are there other benefits beyond just the carbon benefit to this solution that you're putting forward? Sustainable, can you continue to do in the future? Is it going to take away from other solutions that are possible? And nature-based, are you working with and alongside nature instead of against it, or trying to solve it by spreading dust in the atmosphere to cool our planet, right? So we need to move away from this idea of how can we save this species. We need to move towards how can we move to promoting ecosystem health. And that's the big idea. It doesn't matter what organization you're supporting or what organization you're involved with. The big idea is that we need to promote ecosystem health. And so one of the case studies of where we've done that really well is thinking about pollinator habitat. So this is one of those species that, or groups of species that's gotten overlooked, and suddenly we're having all kinds of support for, hey, we're losing all of these pollinators. If we lose them, we won't have our crops, we won't have healthy ecosystems. And there's a huge effort to be able to ensure that we're providing the habitat and not using toxic chemicals that are going to kill off all of our pollinators, from honeybees to all the various different insects that are available. Interestingly, one of those charismatic species that's been the umbrella species for pollinators is the monarch butterfly. And this is the case for a few reasons. Monarchs are gorgeous. They are just stunningly beautiful. A lot of us have an experience with them because they're pervasive. They exist in just about every part of the world. And then on top of that, they do this phenomenal migration going all the way down to Michoacan, Mexico, to this one very particular place to be able to survive the winter there before they migrate back to North America, mostly on the from the Rocky Mountains to the eastern seaboard. And their conservation, us conserving that migration and that species, has ensured that their wintering grounds are conserved. And their wintering grounds are this very specific ecosystem of oyamel fir forests, and it preserves a huge diversity of species. So all of this is to say, we need all efforts everywhere all at once. So leveraging the love and the connection that we have to monarch butterflies to be able to inspire greater efforts of conservation is a positive outcome. That is a great outcome. And all of the restoration efforts that are happening across the entire corridor of this species habitat are going to have huge impacts for a lot of other species. But the important thing is that we don't lose sight of the system as a whole and all of the other critters that are existing within the very large range of this species, and finding ways that if we're investing conservation dollars, we're thinking holistically instead of specifically. So that's just kind of one example of how this charismatic microfauna really, but charismatic species has ended up helping us with pollinator habitat. The funny joke here is that while monarch butterflies are often the species that you see on these pollinator habitat signs, they're actually one of the worst pollinators available. So They have all these spindly legs that pushes them really far off the flower, and they rarely pick up any pollen at all. And they only, seek out nectar where they maybe encounter pollen during their adult life. And so a lot of plants really are not they don't benefit from the presence of monarch butterflies. But because they're a charismatic species and we love them, a lot of conservation dollars are inspired by them. And then those conservation groups can use that money to employ really strategic initiatives that take the whole ecosystem into heart, which most conservation organizations are doing and have been doing. Really, it's a shift in marketing, how we market our conservation efforts. In an ideal world, we could just talk about, the ugliest fly and the slimiest slug and get people excited about them to be able to invest in them to help conserve them because that's the most strategic thing. But instead, there are a lot of marketing strategies to show you animals that evoke an emotion, like this, an emotional connection that inspires you to donate and support and protect them. And then the conservation group can go and protect the habitat, protect more species, and think strategically about how to use those funds. So how can we promote ecosystem health? To me, one of the biggest things that we can do is to educate ourselves and to learn about how ecosystems work. And we can do that any number of ways. We can do that by joining local groups in our communities. Perhaps there's a group that works on educating people around pollinator habitat that you can get involved with. Perhaps there's an advisory board that you can join for a local conservation group to be able to see what their process is for deciding where they're investing in conservation efforts, and maybe perhaps influence or make sure that at the table and in the conversation are conversations about the best and highest use of that dollar to be able to support the ecosystem as a whole. So one of the ways that you can learn about how they work is to go on one of these natural habitat adventures trips. So we do have a little time, so I'll just very quickly kind of show you the itinerary and talk a little bit about how going on one of these trips can actually promote conservation. So the Kingdom of the Monarchs trip. This trip is an incredibly special trip. I was able to go and visit these monarch butterflies with guests last year for 2 weeks, and it was two of the most phenomenal weeks of my life. The trip starts and ends in Mexico City, and it's really spending as much time as possible in this town of Angangeo, which is kind of our leaping point to be able to go and see the Butterfly Biosphere Reserve. So day one, we get out all the way to Angangeo and we get to El Rosario, which is one of the sanctuaries, and we travel high into the oyamel fir forest, first by truck, then by horse, and then finally by hiking. And ultimately, we get right into the area where all of these monarch butterflies are congregating to be able to survive the winter. And these trips are an opportunity to really start to understand how ecosystems function. And you'll learn a ton about the ecology of the monarch butterfly, but you'll also learn about all of the conservation efforts that have ensured that this migration continues and has continued. That evening, we'll explore Angangeo and some of the history of that town, which is initially a mining town and a forestry town that is completely converted to, not completely converted, but now supports a huge amount of ecotourism to be able to ensure that these ecosystems remain. The next day, we go to another butterfly biosphere reserve in Sierra Cinque and have another experience riding the horse and hiking in. And then we spend a little bit more time learning about the history of Angangeo in the afternoon before heading back to that first sanctuary, El Rosario, which is where historically has had the largest population of overwintering butterflies. And you have the opportunity to see this incredible experience. And to me, one of the most powerful things about these trips is not only are your dollars that you're investing in the trip going into the local community, and that local community is actually the group of people taking care of this species in this place, this ecosystem, But you're also taking home all of these pictures that you took, whether with your phone or your camera, and having conversations with friends about what it meant and what it felt like to you to be slapped in the face with an incredibly powerful experience. It's hard to enter this space and not feel like you're connected to the larger ecosystem and feel like something bigger is going on. So it really tugs at the heartstrings, visiting these places, and there's a lot of joy and a lot of contemplation, and everybody experiences it a little bit differently. But eventually we make our way back via Valle de Bravo and have a couple opportunities to see local artwork before making our way back to Mexico City. Now, if we go back to the initial story about wolf reintroduction, which we barely brushed the surface on that story, but we did take a look at it. Now we'll take a look at the Grand Teton and Yellowstone Wildlife Safari itinerary, where you'll start to learn about some of these very big ecosystem stories, where this is one of the largest preserved ecosystems that we have in North America. The Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem is very intact, and Yellowstone and Grand Teton are at the very heart of it. So this 7-day itinerary, a bit longer, starts or ends in Bozeman. So it's round trip, or it's a direct line from Bozeman to Jackson or from Jackson to Bozeman. And it's a really wildlife-oriented trip. So you learn a lot about the history of wildlife in this place and human management of this ecosystem, and all of the cascading impacts of having different wildlife both present and missing in the landscape over time, and what it's meant to be able to reintroduce them. So this itinerary just shows going from Jackson, we spend a day in Grand Teton, floating the Snake River and learning about the riparian ecosystem, and then going up and experiencing the geothermal features in Yellowstone National Park, and some of the interactions between wildlife and those features. The next day we head to Hayden Valley and the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River, and then we spend a lot of time viewing wildlife and looking for those charismatic megafauna in Lamar Valley. So we spend 2 days there before making our way to Bozeman and our departures. So I truly believe that these types of experiences, whether you're with a tour or whether you're just going out and exploring a natural area, a community forest, or a national park, these are the opportunities to be able to connect to these places and to start to think about and ask questions about how these systems function and how we might be able to better support them. The people that come on these trips are, sharing that interest of learning about the natural system, and often are sharing that interest of trying to protect it, because they're choosing World Wildlife Fund and natural habitat adventures because they want to ensure that their travel feeds back into protecting the systems the ecosystems that they're trying to explore. So separate from natural habitat adventures, I'm working on the Northern Peatlands project, and this is really my effort to raise awareness around one of the rarest ecosystems on Earth and shed light on some of the plants and animals that cannot exist without these peatlands. And peatlands are a little bit unique in that they both are threatened by climate change, in that as the climate shifts to warmer and drier, these places might not persist in all of the places that they are today. But beyond that, there are also these hubs for biodiversity. Plants and animals that exist in these ecosystems do not exist anywhere else. And so if we can make sure that we conserve these areas and ensure that this ecosystem is supported, then we can really provide safe haven for a huge array of biodiversity that wouldn't exist otherwise. So you can learn more about that project by heading to my website, twoline.com, and heading to the Peatlands tab, and learn about all the time that I've been spending in our bogs and wetlands and swamps. And if you tune into another natural habitat webinar with me, you'll likely hear me talking about this ecosystem, because it's just one of those places that blows your mind every time you learn something more about it. So I'd love to just close out with taking a few questions, but thank you so much for being here and spending time with me today.
Thanks again, Charlie. We have some questions, but I just want to remind everybody that they can submit their questions via the questions field in the control panel. Let's see here. Can you define umbrella species again? Is it the same as a keystone species, or is there a difference there, a subtle difference that
Yeah,
we
that's
should
a
identify?
really good question. So keystone species is one that it's an ecological term to describe the phenomena that we observe out in the world, where a particular species has an outsized impact on the ecosystem that they exist in. So wolves would be a keystone species, where without wolves, that ecosystem starts to degrade, it starts to fall apart. Another keystone species example that's great is a beaver. Without beavers, we lose our wetlands. We have different stream stream ecosystem function. And so keystone species are just ones, the really, really technical definition is if you were to take all of their biomass, and then you would have you would have a proportion of their biomass to the total biomass of the ecosystem, you would have a proportion. So maybe it's 1/10 of the ecosystem. That would be a really huge animal and really pervasive. But you would expect that it would have a 1/10 impact on that ecosystem. But actually, it has like a 9/10 impact, that without it, you'd have this huge, huge cascading impacts. So that's the idea behind keystone species, that they're really, really important to preserve the integrity of the ecosystem. Whereas a species that isn't a keystone, maybe there's another species that essentially would occupy the same space, feed the same animals, provide the same habitat. So the loss of a different species might not have the same impact as losing your apex predator. The difference between keystone and umbrella species is that umbrella species is the term used in the world of conservation efforts to describe the impact of the concept of, if we conserve this species, inherently all of these other species will benefit. So they're very related terms. It's almost the same thing, but the umbrella species is really describing, if we conserve this species, who else is it going to positively impact? Whereas keystone species is more about ecosystem function. And if we conserve that species, or not conserve, sorry, if we look at that species in the ecosystem, it has an outsized impact on how that ecosystem functions. But a lot of times they're one and the same.
Thank you for clarifying that. I was not aware of the differences there. Are there any NatHab trips that feature beavers?
Gosh, there are a lot of trips that you would see beavers, but I'm not aware of a trip that would really focus on them in a really intense way. But one of the trips that you would see them on potentially is the Grand Teton and Yellowstone trip. Beavers occupy that ecosystem. I would imagine that you would have a chance of seeing them on the Acadia trip, so that's in New England. And there would be a lot of trips that you'd have an opportunity to see them, but in my time guiding in Grand Teton and Yellowstone, just because you're not spending a ton of time in the river ecosystem, I don't think that I've ever seen a beaver on one of my trips. I've seen them out exploring on my own. But maybe that's part of the seasonality of it, of when I'm typically guiding in those places, because I don't guide very often right now with everything else that I've got going on with the business. But you can definitely look up popular places to see beavers. There are a lot of places in the Adirondacks, but the other little tiny tidbit I'll give you about beavers is that there was a point in history where, just thinking about creative conservation efforts, because beavers are this keystone species where they have a huge impact on the ecosystem. They're also ecosystem engineers. Without them, we wouldn't have all of the habitat complexity. There would be certain habitats that would be missing from the landscape without them. And we did hunt beavers to extirpation in a lot of regions throughout the country and beyond. And one of the ways that they reintroduced beavers was by parachuting them into really remote habitats. So there are videos online. This is amazing. But you can actually see they built these wooden crates and they had parachutes. And so they would literally drop these beavers out of the plane in their wooden crates, and they would float down and rest, and the beaver would chew its way out of its enclosure. And then this was a highly successful conservation restoration effort where those beavers were very successful. They took over the ecosystems and restored a lot of the habitats that were missing. So that was a roundabout way of answering your question, but thank you.
That is fascinating. I just Googled it and I will be showing the footage to my children later and talking about keystone species. That is fabulous. They will be
I don't
very
know why
interested.
more people don't know. It's pretty amazing. I think
Well,
no
I
one
imagine
believes it.
I imagine that even though you don't see beavers, you'll see a lot of signs of beavers when you're out in on
Yeah,
your NatHab trips, and certainly
absolutely.
have opportunities for discussion about their importance and role in the ecosystem.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. That's absolutely true. You can't go on the Grand Teton and Yellowstone trip without seeing so much beaver evidence from beaver chews and whatnot. So yeah.
Do muskrats do any similar activities to beavers, or do they play any similar role there?
They're not known as engineers as much, but their activity does encourage more plant growth on the banks of the rivers because they're an herbivore and they feed on a lot of the woody stems and the perennial grasses on the edge of the river. And so when you mow down areas like that and they have enough time to regenerate, it actually encourages better growth, like more robust root systems and thicker stems and overall a better health for the plant. So they do have a role in that, and absolutely as a prey species. And I do think that the other aspect that we didn't talk about today is how charismatic species influence the research side of things. So I always try to think of this as like, you know, in terms of the monarch butterfly migration, they travel 1,400 miles, sometimes more, to be able to get down to this very one specific place. But we know about that because it's this very charismatic butterfly, and somebody asked the question and then was able to get the funding to be able to study that. And so sometimes when you're looking for funding for the toad, it might not rise to the top of the stack compared to getting funding to study wolves. So when we talk about, I always caveat the idea of, we talk about keystone species, we talk about ecosystem engineers. I don't think we've brushed the surface of how much of an impact every species has on the ecosystem, because one, we have finite resources, and two, those resources are going towards those charismatic studies. And that's a whole nother topic for a whole series of talks about how different research projects get funded. But I'm always trying to check myself when answering your very good question about muskrats and their impact. It's possible that they're doing quite a bit of engineering, and we could learn some more about that.
Hmm. Very true. Well, Charlie, thank you so much for presenting today and for putting a bow on it like you did, tying all those strings together. I always learn so much from you. I also, well, let me pass it back to you for closing comments.
Thank you, Sunny. Yeah, thank you all for joining today. I've got a number of webinars coming up in February, so tune back in. And thank you to all of you. Just being here is checking the box of what I'm talking about, is seeking opportunities to learn more about these things and to discuss them. And that's a huge step in being able to support the ecosystems that support us. So thanks for being here, and feel free to sign up for my monthly newsletter and stay in touch. Thank you.
Absolutely. I also want to thank everybody who tuned in please join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. Actually, no, next Monday. Leave the weekend. Happy weekend, everybody. Join us again on Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, we'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.